I believe it was in November 2010. Alright. In addition, that was my last show with the band. Of course, I've chosen to build on the estate since then. You know KK? The name Downing is linked to strong twin guitar riffs, the famous Flying V, and years of service to Judas Priest. Even so, after more than 40 years of making heavy metal history, strangely, he left in silence. There was no goodbye or big send-off, only questions that were not answered. Downing was one of the original members of Judas Priest. He and Glenn Tipton and Rob Halford turned the band from a little-known act into a metal powerhouse. His unique style can be heard on hits like Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight, and Painkiller. But beneath the pride, there are deep-seated disagreements. Downing got stronger until he realized he didn't fit in the band he helped build anymore. Why did a legend like KK? Why did Downing leave Judas Priest when the band was doing so well? Did he really choose to do it? Or was it the result of years of fighting within the group? And finally, has he ever been fully recognized for all the great things he did for Judas Priest? Not only is KK Downing's life the story of a great guitarist, it's also the story of a solo artist who is always looking for his place in the band he helped make. From being an unruly kid in West Bromwich to a heavy metal star and then being kicked out of his own band, we'll go into great detail about his life. When he was young, Kenneth Keith Downing Jr., better known as KK. She was born in West Bromwich, England, on October 27, 1951. Downing didn't have the perfect childhood like many other kids might have had because he grew up in a working-class home. Both of his parents worked hard to support their family in the tough British economy after the war. His father was a strict, traditional man who didn't like anything that wasn't the way things were supposed to be. Due to the fact that his mother had no connection to music, young Kenny didn't feel much pressure to follow any artistic goals. Downing was naturally restless and unhappy with his surroundings from a very young age. He did not like how rigid his family was, and he felt even worse about how strict British schools were at the time. When he was 15, he did something brave but dangerous. His schooling ended. Without any skills or clear instructions, Downing was left to find his way in a world that didn't allow people who didn't follow the rules. As soon as he graduated from high school, he started living a crazy life full of drugs, drinks, and parties all the time. He did a bunch of weird jobs to make money, like a lot of young people in the rock and roll scene at the time, but none of them were interesting to him. His anger at everyday life kept growing, and he thought that music was the only way to escape it. However, if Downing had only been a rebellious teenager, he might have ended up lost in England's harsh industrial settings. He found refuge in music. He was blown away by the raw power and wild energy of the electric guitar when he first heard acts like Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and Cream. Later in the 1960s, Downing met Ian Hill, a young bassist who had also grown up in West Bromwich. They quickly became close because they both loved music. Hill wasn't just a friend anymore, the one who pushed Downing to become a real musician. They started talking about making a band, and soon, the basics of Judas Priest began to take shape. At this point, Downing was still a young guitarist who didn't have a lot of technical knowledge. But what made him stand out was his unwavering hunger and drive. He worked on his skills nonstop and found his own style, an aggressive, high-energy approach that would become Judas Priest's signature sound. Even though she came from a poor family and had a rough childhood, KK, it was Downing's anger and desire to fight that turned into the force that would change his life. All of his struggles, the poor food, and the sleepless nights he spent training were steps on the way to becoming a heavy metal legend. But Downing didn't know at the time that the trip he and Ian Hill were taking would not only change their lives, but also rock music as we know it. Beginners in their careers. In the beginning of Judas Priest, there wasn't a lot of fame or big stages. Instead, the band was constantly fighting to stay alive. When KK Downing and Ian Hill started the band, they had a dream that not many people were willing to follow. Heavy metal had not yet become its own form. Blues rock was still the most popular type of music at the time. However, Downing thought that Judas Priest could make something new, something stronger and more precise than anything that already existed. Judas Priest used to play in bars and small rooms whenever they could in the beginning. They didn't have a record deal, professional managers, or even good instruments. It became normal for bands to play on small stages with bad sound equipment and few people watching. But Downing didn't give up. Instead, He saw it as a challenge, a test of his endurance and a chance to improve his skills while helping to shape the band's character. Downing and Ian Hill kept Judas Priest going, but he was never happy with how things were going. He wanted Judas Priest to be louder, meaner, and completely different from the other bands that were playing at the time. The biggest problem, though, was that they didn't have a stable group. The band had many lead singers, which made it hard for Downing to fully describe the sound of the band the way he wanted to. In 1973, when Rob Halford joined, everything changed. His soaring, powerful singing gave Judas Priest a whole new sound. Downing could take the band's music to a new level now that he wasn't limited by the work of past singers. Sharper, faster, and heavy. Even though Halford was there, one important piece was still missing. The band needed a second guitarist to play with Downing. Soon, Glenn Tipton joined, and that hole was filled. With that, Judas Priest as the world would know it began to take shape. 3 musicians, Downing, Tipton, and Halford, became the core of Judas Priest and helped the band go from being unknown to becoming heavy metal stars. When Tipton arrived, Downing was able to make his dream of twin guitar duets come true, where the 2 guitars didn't just play beat, but also worked together to make complex riffs and high solos. This was unheard of in blues rock, and it became one of Judas Priest's signature sounds, helping them become one of the first heavy metal bands. But even though Judas Priest had a strong team, they still had to deal with a harsh truth. They had to get a record deal to really make it work. They finally got signed with Gull Records after years of trouble, and their first record, Rockaralla, came out in 1974. It was both a big deal and a letdown for Downing. The sound he had in mind wasn't on the record. It still had too much blues in it, and wasn't as wild as the music that was burning in his mind. But Downing didn't run away. Instead, he used it as fuel to move Judas Priest forward. He and Tipton started to play around with a louder, more aggressive sound, sharper riffs, and faster tempos to get ready for their big break. The big break came with Sad Wings of Destiny in 1976. That record changed everything. With songs like Victim of Changes and The Ripper, Judas Priest went all the way into heavy metal and left behind any blues rock inspirations. These guys weren't looking for their sound anymore. The band was ready to take over. But KK was at the center of this change. Downing, who led Judas Priest from being an unknown band to a storm that would shake the rock world. They weren't just another band playing in obscure bars anymore. Not only did they have a record deal and a unique sound, but they also had a clear picture of what the future held. We were just getting started, though. The rock music style heavy metal was still new, and no one knew how far it could go. Not that Downing needed to know. He only knew one thing. Judas Priest would become famous, and he would do anything to make that happen. Greatest years with Judas Priest. It wasn't until 1976, when Sad Wings of Destiny came out, that Judas Priest finally moved out from behind blues rock bands and into the heavy metal world. You know KK? With his razor-sharp lines and bold playing style, Downing turned Judas Priest's sound into a destructive weapon. To get to the top, though, you needed more than just strength. The band needed to have a clear brand and name, and most importantly, they needed songs that could define a whole genre. The year 1977 was the start of a whole new era when Judas Priest signed with Columbia Records. They could reach more people now that they weren't just an underground band making do with cheap recordings and limited gear. But that meant they had to come up with new music that would set Judas Priest apart from every other band in the world. At this point, Downing had completely honed his playing style. He then threw himself into writing songs with Glenn Tipton, trying out ideas that were louder and more aggressive. That which held them back in the world. At this point, Downing had completely honed his playing style. He then threw himself into writing songs with Glenn Tipton, trying out ideas that were louder and more aggressive. That which held them back in the past was gone. It was totally given up in favor of compositions that were sharper, faster, and stronger. Judas Priest put out a series of groundbreaking records in just 3 years, such as Stained Class in 1978 and Hellbent for Leather in 1979. Not only did they shape their sound during this time, but they also created an iconic picture. For the first time, Judas Priest came out wearing black leather, studs, and a look that wasn't afraid to be edgier. Heavy metal changed hard rock into something completely different, if it had any hard rock parts left over. KK Downing was one of the first real heavy metal guitar heroes. He had long hair, the famous flying V, and an electrifying stage personality. But everything they had done before 1980 was not even close to British Steel, which is considered one of the most important albums in metal history. After more than 10 years of writing songs together, Downing and Tipton had gotten very good at it by this point. There was a great mix between raw power and mainstream appeal on songs like Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight. A wider range of people heard these songs, not just metal fans, getting people who had never heard of Judas Priest to listen. Heavy metal was no longer just a part of the underground scene. It had become a part of everyday life. After British Steel, Judas Priest was one of the best metal bands in the world in the 1980s. Tours that lasted months, arenas that were packed, and record releases that came right after each other with no signs of slowing down defined this time. Downing and Tipton kept improving their twin guitar attack with each new record, making it smoother and more interesting. The 1982 album Screaming for Vengeance not only made them even more powerful, but it also made them very popular. You've Got Another Thing Coming was one of the most famous metal hits of the decade. It also made Judas Priest one of the most popular rock bands in the United States. But Downing never got comfortable with his success. He always looked for new ways to make Judas Priest do even better. British Steel was the big break for heavy metal in the business world, and Defenders of the Faith, 1984, brought back the hardness and grit. This time, along with Turbo, 1986, and Ram It Down, 1988, showed that Judas Priest was ready to try new things. The synth-driven glam metal influences in Turbo caused a lot of debate, but Ram It Down made it clear that they had not forgotten their metal roots. However, everything they had done up to that point seemed like just practice for Painkiller, 1990, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest heavy metal albums ever. At this point, Downing and Tipton took things to the very end. When Painkiller played, the sounds were like a storm. There were a lot of solos, and the intensity was unmatched. There were no signs of hard rock or any other style. Heavy metal at its purest and most powerful level. Things started to go wrong for Judas Priest just as they were at their best. Rob Halford left the band in 1992, leaving a hole that can't be filled. Judas Priest wasn't the same after Tim Ripper Owens joined, but the other members tried to keep going with him. Downing loved to write and play music, but he felt like something was missing. The real spirit of Judas Priest was the way Halford, Downing, and Tipton worked together, and when one piece left, the balance was upset. When Halford came back in 2003, it gave fans hope that Judas Priest could get back to their old glory. Although, KK had changed by that time. Downing, years of stress within the band, pressure from management, and a situation with Glenn Tipton that was getting worse made him feel cut off from the group. Even as Judas Priest kept putting out records and going on successful tours, Downing started to think about doing something he had never thought about before, leaving Judas Priest. In 2011, as the band got ready for the Epitaph tour, Downing made a choice that shocked the metal community. 30 years later, he quit Judas Priest. There wasn't a farewell event or a final show to thank the fans. Instead, he sent a letter saying he wouldn't be going on the tour. Many people were shocked by the change, but Downing knew it had to happen. The pressures had been building for too long, and he felt less and less valued in the band he had helped create. Judas Priest said at first that he left for personal reasons, but the truth was much more complicated than that. Later, Downing said that he quit because he had long-standing problems with Glenn Tipton, differences with management, and a deep-seated sense of being pushed to the side in the band he had devoted his life to. Unlike other band changes, Judas Priest didn't try to get him to stay. Instead, they quickly switched him out for Richie Falk. They had a much younger guitarist and had no plans to bring Downing back, not even as a guest. Longtime fans were furious about this choice, and they wondered if Judas Priest could still have soul after so easily replacing one of its founding members. Born in West Bromwich and living on the streets, KK went from being a poor boy to a heavy metal hero. Downing had finished everything. Was this really the end of his story, though? Or was there still one more chapter to write? Everyday life. Backstage, KK Downing was an insanely hot guitarist whose deep riffs and electrifying stage personality ignited tens of thousands of people. When he left the lights, though, he was a totally different person, shy, quiet, and mostly by himself. During his best years with Judas Priest, Downing was never the type of rock star who went to too many parties like many of his peers. He did give in to the rock and roll lifestyle of drinking and parties sometimes, but it was never something he did for good. Downing was single and never got married or had kids. His private life was pretty much kept secret from the public, not in any public relationships or scandals like a lot of other rock artists. He felt like music was the only thing that would ever love him. After leaving Judas Priest in 2011, KK, after more than 40 years with the band, Downing thought he could finally live a quiet life. He put a lot of money into the ambitious plan to turn his private farm into a high-end golf resort and tourist spot called Astbury Hall Golf Course. In addition to the money, it was his second dream outside of music and a way for him to leave a legacy that would last beyond Judas Priest. But things did not turn out the way he thought they would. There were big financial losses on the project, which turned it into a disaster. Having spent years putting his whole heart and soul into Astbury Hall, he had no choice but to sell it. To make things even worse, he had to give up the royalties he had earned from Judas Priest songs. This was a terrible choice because they were not only his way of making money, but also the things he had spent his whole life making. From being a heavy metal icon, Downing was suddenly faced with the harsh truth. There is no band, job, or assets. He didn't give up hope that she would come back, no matter what. Downing thought it was his chance to get back together with Judas Priest when Glenn Tipton was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Downing thought he would be asked back to fill in for Tipton since his illness was making it hard for him to perform. Judas Priest, on the other hand, shut the door on him totally. They didn't bring him back. Instead, they kept performing without him and hired Andy Sneap to fill in for Tipton temporarily. It was a terrible blow to Downing, not only because he wasn't allowed to come back, but also because it proved that the band he had helped build had turned its back on him totally. In retrospect, he said that this was the time he knew the door to Judas Priest was shut for good. But Downing wasn't going to let this be the end of his career. In 2019, after almost 10 years of quiet, he said he would be back with a new project called KK's Priest, a group he started with Tim Ripper Owens, who had been Judas Priest's singer when Halford wasn't available. Downing saw KK's Priest as the only way to carry on his reputation, even though it wasn't the same as Judas Priest. When he came back, it caused arguments in the metal community. For some diehard Judas Priest fans, KK's Priest was just a cheap copy. They said that without Halford or Tipton, it was just a nostalgia act. His fans, on the other hand, didn't agree. They saw it as a right way to keep the spirit of Judas Priest alive, the band he helped start but was later kicked out of. No matter what happened, KK's Priest proved one thing. KK Downing never really stopped playing heavy metal. Even though he had been through a lot, he still played his guitar, stood on stage, and fought for the music that had made his life. Although Judas Priest went ahead without him, KK Downing made his own way, writing a new part of his story by himself. Right now, Life and Memory. KK quit heavy metal after more than 50 years of playing it. Downing nonetheless is not yet prepared to give up his guitar. Even though he is in his 70s and no longer plays with Judas Priest, he still plays music with the fighting spirit of a tough guitarist. The people who turn their backs on him are no longer important to him. He doesn't play for money. He does it because he loves music and has never been able to give it up. Downing is still playing with KK's Priest, the band he started to keep the traditional heavy metal sound alive. This project may never be as popular as Judas Priest, but for Downing, it means freedom and having full power over his music. He put out Sermons of the Sinner in 2021, an album that was heavily influenced by the best years of Judas Priest. It was a clear statement that he has never lost the ability to write and play music. Even though Downing doesn't play on as many big stages as he did with Judas Priest, he still gives it his all on tour with KK's Priest. But these days, he mostly just lives a relaxing life. After losing Astbury Hall Golf Course, Downing doesn't have any other business projects that keep him from making music. He lives a simple life and writes music, talks to his devoted friends, and sometimes shows up at rock concerts. But there is one truth that can't be denied. Since he left, Judas Priest has never recognized him as an important member of the band. He still keeps a cold distance from his old bandmates, which makes many of his fans sad because the relationship should have been honored, not wiped out. No matter what, KK Downing left a lasting mark on history. He wasn't just a part of Judas Priest. He helped make the group happen. The famous twin guitar attack he came up with Glenn Tipton set the tone for the band's sound and became the model for heavy metal. He helped make heavy metal the powerful and razor-sharp force it is today. Without him, Judas Priest might not have hit the heights they did. He had an impact on a whole group of guitarists, not just on Judas Priest. The way that Downing and Tipton played has been copied by many bands, including Megadeth's Dave Mustaine, Metallica's James Hetfield, Ozzy Osbourne's Zakk Wylde, and Iron Maiden's Adrian Smith and Dave Murray. Modern heavy metal, especially thrash metal, was built on their fast-paced guitar playing. Later, bands like Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth would take it to even higher levels. In addition to his skill, Downing's stage personality helped define what a real heavy metal guitarist should be like. He always sat with his head banging during fiery solos and held his hair long so it would flow in the stage lights. Because of these parts, people thought of what a metal musician should look like. Without a doubt, KK Bach has had an impact on the typical heavy metal musician we know today. Downing. But one bad thing about his legacy is that he isn't recognized in Judas Priest's official past. When they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2022, KK, even though Downing was asked, he wasn't given any extra attention. A lot of fans were angry about this because they thought Judas Priest would not have been the same without him. He shared the stage with his old bandmates for a short show, but it was clear that he was not part of the band. KK Downing is still a real-life heavy metal hero, even though he is no longer in Judas Priest. His work can't be erased, and even though Judas Priest is moving on without him, he has left his own legacy, which lives on through KK's Priest and the impact he had on many artists. He might not have had a famous solo career like Ozzy Osbourne or the musicians from Metallica or Iron Maiden, but his name is still talked about a lot. But for heavy metal fans, KK Downing is an important part of rock history that can't be replaced. Feelings about KK. How rough was Downing's journey? Do you think Judas Priest is still Judas Priest without him? Or do you think his leaving was a necessary part of change? Do you want him to come back with KK's Priest? Or do you think he should always be with Judas Priest? Tell us what you think in the space below. Remember to hit like and subscribe if you want to hear more inspiring stories about rock and metal stars.